This episode of New Politics was released on the 14th of September, 2024, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
Welcome to New Politics. In this episode, Bill Shorten is leaving politics, but what's the legacy that he's leaving behind? The reform to the Reserve Bank Board and the failure of bipartisanship yet again, the protests against weapon exports in Melbourne, and the politics of mining and live sheep exports in the lead up to the next federal election. I'm Eddie Djokovic, editor of New Politics.
I'm David Lewis, a concept of a plan.
Just a reminder, we don't have the billionaire owners or even the millionaire owners to support us, and that's the way that we'd like to keep it. But if you would like to support New Politics, you can do that through Patreon or Substack, or you can make a donation at newpolitics.com.au, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. Bill Shorten will be leaving politics, and it will be the end of a 17-year career that coincided with the election of the Rudd government in 2007 and will end in February next year when he takes up the position of Vice-Chancellor at the University of Canberra. Shorten has spent almost half of his time in Parliament as a member of the government. He's been a parliamentary secretary, he was minister, shadow minister, but he will be best remembered as the leader of the opposition between 2013 and 2019, when he almost won the election that he wasn't expected to win against Malcolm Turnbull in 2016, and then went on to lose the election that he was expected to win against Scott Morrison in 2019. So he didn't become Prime Minister, which is the ambition of every MP who walks into Parliament. And you don't have to become Prime Minister to have a successful political career, but it's safe to say that there's usually more to a resignation than an MP simply wanting to leave politics because they've had enough of it and wanting to spend more time with family. There's probably a few factional issues going on, and perhaps it was Bill Shorten realising that the small pathway to becoming the Prime Minister has been fully extinguished. But aside from all of that, I think we can say that Bill Shorten has had a very effective political career.
It's an odd political career in that he is loathed by the right. The Murdoch press managed to plant into a lot of, I guess I'll call them swinging voters' heads, that there was something about him that you couldn't trust, despite the fact that he was no better or no worse than any other politician. He played to advantage. His work on the NDIS was pretty much very good on the whole. The NDIS, of course, was ruined by the Liberal Party. Bill Shorten was across the brief, knew how it should be fixed. Whether he could do it or not is a whole other issue. And I wonder if one of the reasons that he's stepping down is because of the damage they'd done, and he'd realised that he's not going to be able to improve his legacy from here on in, and things will just get worse. As far as I can tell, there's been no major scandal. He was one of the better ministers, I think. One of the questions is how much did he have to do with the rolling of Rudd Gillard as a factional leader? It doesn't matter who you are, you have blood on your hands. Choices need to be made. And we don't know exactly how much he had to do with it. Whether he was right in et tu brute with the last knife, stabbing it in, or whether he was hands-off, like more of a Don Corleone Godfather figure.
Oh, well, I guess a political career is never as good as supporters suggest or as bad as the detractors make it out to be. And I think with Bill Shorten, it's probably somewhere in between. But we do now have the gall of the media to come out and asking whether the changes that he was planning to introduce to make the housing market more equitable would be useful right now during a housing affordability crisis. And sorry about this, people, but you're 5 years too late about this. And these are the same people in the media who were rubbishing all of these proposals back in 2019 and rubbishing Bill Shorten by continuously pushing that narrative of, well, why do people hate Bill Shorten so much? And generally, you can never give these people in the media an inch. But that's essentially what Bill Shorten will be remembered for. He was hammered on negative gearing issues, hammered on capital gains tax, on franking credits, and I think this fed into issues about how he was going to take away money from people who never actually had that money in the first place, and then that subsequently led to trust issues. And as you mentioned, David, there was that role that he played in the downfall of Kevin Rudd in 2010 and then again in the downfall of Julia Gillard in 2013. And that role was never fully understood or explained. So the media put in its own version of the events about that. And the underlying story was that it was all Bill Shorten's fault. Who knows, it sort of was, or maybe it was. But unlike Scott Morrison, he just didn't keep his hands clean enough. So those trust issues did linger on. But I think the big issue was that Bill Shorten did have a public image problem, which the Labor Party didn't really correct. And you can't just go ahead and put a new head onto a political leader, but you can brush up some of their features and make them look a little bit different and more electable. But Bill Shorten was actually a very good communicator and looked $1 million when you did see him live, and in all of those town hall meetings that he held, he looked strong and he looked solid and tall, even though he's not really a tall man. But that just didn't translate televisually, and most people do see their political leaders on television rather than seeing them live in the flesh.
On that point of him being a great communicator in person, the two who sprang to mind for me who didn't come across very well on television but were really electrifying in front of a crowd was Bob Carr, Premier of New South Wales, and John Howard. So it was somewhat a tragedy for Bill Shorten that he wasn't able to transcend that perceived weakness that he didn't look good televisually or on radio, because Bob Carr had that deep resonant voice, whereas John Howard has a readier tenor. I'm sure there are others. They're the two who stood out to me, and I haven't seen every single politician speak. I've seen a lot of politicians speak. Most of them do a fine job.
And I think the other issue is that Bill Shorten also had this unusual position of being the Minister responsible for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and the Minister for Government Services before and after the 9-year period of the coalition government between 2013 and 2022. He was instrumental in creating the NDIS legislation in 2013. It was enacted and implemented by the coalition, almost destroyed by the coalition, and patched up by the Labor government since 2022. And the NDIS, the architecture of the scheme and the role that it's meant to play, well, I think that's a good legacy to have, but it was totally ruined by the coalition, as you referred to, David, and now it's more of a political and funding problem for the current government. And to make it sustainable, the government has implemented a cutback, had billions of dollars available for AUKUS, but couldn't find the money for the NDIS. But the issue is that whenever you cut money, especially from programs such as home care support for kids with autism, well, that's a bad news story coming out every week in the media. So I think that's a good and not so good legacy with the NDIS. And Bill Shorten, as Minister for Government Services, well, he was the instigator of the Royal Commission into robo-debt, and I think that was actually one of the best Royal Commissions that we've ever had as far as shining the light on bad government behaviour is concerned. So on one hand, an excellent Royal Commission, but on the other, well, no one from the coalition government or the public service has been brought to justice or been held to account. And we still haven't seen the names in the special sealed section of the Royal Commission report yet. And there was some speculation that Bill Shorten might be actually one of those names because of his role in setting up data matching and the debt collection system that led to the development of the robo-debt scheme. I don't think that's the case, but that's the message that's being pushed by the Liberal Party staffers. So once again, a good piece of action on the robo-debt Royal Commission, but there's no real tangible results to come from the Royal Commission, and no one has been held to account for these disasters. And I think the other issue is that this seems to be the end of the battle between some of the Labor factions in Sydney and Melbourne. And in Melbourne, Bill Shorten's right faction might lose control of the seat of Maribyrnong to the left faction. And that's because there's one less seat in Victoria at the next election. And with Brendan O'Connor also leaving Parliament, that's one MP and two candidates wanting to jostle over two seats. And as we all know, 3 does not go into 2. So this might not be a pretty sight when it comes to pre-selections for the next federal election. And it's probably another reason for Shorten deciding to leave politics. The right faction has become weaker in Victoria, and he might not be up to building the right faction up again.
One of the rules of Labor politics, it's probably the only real given, is that it will always be dirty, it'll always be complicated, and they tend to hate each other more than they hate the Liberal Party or the Greens. And this will be almost certainly, and if I'm wrong, that's great, a long drawn out, awful situation. Heads will roll, careers will be destroyed, there'll be a lot of anger and bitterness. What we will see in public will be about a tenth of what was happening behind. It's probably almost as true with the Liberal Party, but it's a bit different too. Labor will admit that it can get nasty, whereas the Liberal Party tends to think that it won't, all the while stabbing each other in the back. It's unfortunate that the seat went, especially given that Melbourne is a fairly progressive city. But we do know that despite the best efforts of Tony Abbott and Scott Morrison, the Electoral Commission is one of our very best departments. And so how it fell out was how it had to fall out, according to the extremely fair rules. The sitting member wasn't happy, obviously, but they're pretty open and transparent with the boundary changes. And I think Labor now has to be careful that it doesn't destroy itself over one seat. But when you look at the range of egos and lack of talent with some people, there's some brilliant people down there, but there's also third-raters who think that they're Ben Chifley or Bob Hawke. For people like us, it's going to be great fun.
This is New Politics with Eddie Djokovic and David Lewis, one of Australia's top 10 podcasts on Australian politics and news commentary. You can also find us at newpolitics.com.au, and you can also support us through Patreon and Substack.
The Labor government has had a series of reforms that it wants to make to the board of the Reserve Bank, and this relates to setting up a specialist interest rate setting board within the RBA, and the coalition has decided that it's not going to be part of these negotiations and has taken the bat and ball with them and gone straight home. And maybe that's fair enough. The government shouldn't be negotiating with the coalition anyway, because the coalition is the most destructive force in Australian politics, and they just do not care about bipartisanship when they're in government and just do whatever they want. And when they're in opposition, they block, they obfuscate, they don't allow the government of the day to achieve their agenda and be the government of the day. And the message that the government is putting out is that they do want to negotiate with the coalition far more than they want to negotiate with the Australian Greens. Here's the Treasurer Jim Chalmers outlining some of these issues.
I'd rather not have to do a deal with the Greens. If I can avoid it, I would. But I'm committed to these reforms. These reforms are really important. They're really considered. They've been in the public domain for the best part of a couple of years now. They've been the subject of, welcome discussion and debate, and it's time to make this legislative change. When it comes to the Greens, I'd rather not have to come to an accommodation with the Greens. I've made that clear publicly and privately to them, to the coalition, and I've made it publicly very, very clear. So I'd rather not have to consider those sorts of things. Unfortunately, the coalition may be forcing our hand.
And of course there might be some politics at play here. It might be a case where the government has always wanted to negotiate with the Greens but felt that the money markets would see this as dealing with economic extremists, and that's why they're putting up all of these proposals that the coalition just simply won't agree to. And then it can go on and argue the case that the coalition is being completely unreasonable and force them to negotiate with the Greens. Now, that might be the case, but politics is a game like Survivor, where you have to treat everyone as a potential ally so you can go on and achieve your political agenda. And there's also the art of negotiation, where if you do end up negotiating with the Greens and other senators, well, you do have to horse trade and offer things in exchange. And we've seen with Peter Dutton that he is a destructive, negative force in politics. He doesn't want to negotiate. He says no to everything. He's a bomb thrower, and he also might not have the intellect or the gravitas to engage in negotiations on this sort of level. But it's the Liberal Party and the National Party, well, they're the real anarchists and the nihilists here, not the Australian Greens.
Even if you wanted the Liberal Party around, the duopoly as you sometimes hear it called, surely you wouldn't want the anarcho-syndicalists who are the current Dutton Liberal Party, to have any say on anything. We saw what 9 years of this did. Even with a moderate leader, that faction just undermined, undercut, destroyed everything that he tried to do. Took money from him. He had to throw in $1 million right at the end, which that money might have been the thing that got them over the line, or it mightn't have been. And the thing that these types of people hate is being ignored, is being not treated with the respect that they believe that they're due. If the government went and started negotiating with Sarah Hanson-Young, who the coalition hates, Maureen Faruqi, who the coalition hates, I know that there are people in the Labor Party who hate these figures too, but surely you dislike the destructive wreckers of the Liberal Party more, rather than people who, even if you don't agree with them, are trying to be constructive, even if they don't get it right all the time. Surely those are people you can do business with. And it would hurt, as a bonus, the coalition much more to have David Pocock, Monique Ryan, or any of the Teals, particularly the Teals who won extremely safe Liberal seats. They're trying to bring Josh Frydenberg back into Kooyong. All I can say, he must like losing. She has been a very good local member. There's no question about that. And she's been consistent. And she tells the truth of what her position is. And really, Josh Frydenberg rarely did any of that. So he's got, I think, very little chance of winning Kooyong back, despite what the Murdoch press is saying and the Liberal Party is saying. Surely you'd want this to keep happening, and that you'd want to build a better parliament. And with a left faction, or centre-left faction, or whatever they're called. But surely you'd want to force the Liberal Party into a major reform, at the very least.
On the sticking point for the coalition on this issue is the nominations process to the Reserve Bank board, and they think there will be a process that will result in boards being stacked. Now, I'm not sure if they're actually arguing for a greater ability to stack the board than what's being proposed, because whenever the coalition is in office, they stack the board with as many of their people as possible, and that's absolutely everything, whether it's the board of the Reserve Bank, the Fair Work Commission, the ABC, Australia Post, Human Rights Commission, you name it, and the coalition will always stack a board with their own people. So I think it's a bit rich for them to come out and say that they're concerned about the process for how people will be appointed to the Reserve Bank board. But aside from that, and we've discussed this in recent episodes, David, that the Liberal Party is the real enemy of the Labor Party in electoral terms and also ideologically. And Peter Dutton and the Liberal Party, well, they just want to blow everything up. They want to stall the parliamentary process. And they're like the Luddites destroying the looms back in the 19th century. They're probably even far worse than that. And fair enough, if the agenda for the government is to try and paint the coalition as a group of nihilists, well, absolutely go for it, because that's what they are. But this process of negating the role of the Australian Greens, and in elections they get around 13% of the primary vote, the Liberal Party gets around 24% of the vote. So it's not, sure, it's almost double, but it's not that far away. One Nation gets around 5% of the primary vote, and they're given a lot more respect than the Greens are ever given. And this anti-Green sentiment is pervasive within the media as well. Here's an exchange between Sarah Ferguson at the ABC and Shadow Treasurer Angus Taylor.
Now, the government is left with the option of either dropping this reform that you and the government considers to be fundamental in the task of fighting inflation. The option is for them to negotiate with the Greens. Are you comfortable telling the Australian public, telling borrowers, your voters, that you will let the Greens now potentially reshape the form of the Reserve Bank?
Well, that's a choice for the government, not us. But if Jim Chalmers is prepared to negotiate with the Greens on this, it's important to note that the Greens want the government to take the Reserve Bank over and to take the banking system over. If he is prepared to negotiate with the Greens on those terms, when the alternative could have been absolute continuity of the current board, it tells you a lot about what his motives might be, Sarah. And I think it proves to us why it's the right thing now to move on. If the government chooses to negotiate with the Greens, that's a choice for them.
It's hard to slam people and then go and negotiate with them, but that's what the government will have to do. There has to be a level of mutual horse trading and deals made with the Greens and the independents, and it's probably a lazy option to go and negotiate with the coalition anyway, but this is where it all sits at the moment.
It is very possible that smarter people than us got a great strategy that will...
Oh, there wouldn't be very many of those, David.
No, I'm not saying it's probable. I'm just saying that, it's possible that, as you suggested, there's a longer term strategy here. But unless you're being extremely clever, these types of things can blow up in your face. You've got to be focused. I said it the other week about political parties, but also in political stoushes. You've got to be focused. You've got to be disciplined. You've got to be aware of everything that's going on. You've got to think 2 or 3 steps ahead of what the other side might do and be prepared for every option. And I'm not sure that any of that's happening.
Oh, well, I guess that's the politics of the process, but within politics you also have to look at the tangible results. And some of our audience have asked us about why there is so much emphasis by this government about having bipartisanship with the coalition. And the question is, well, where did it get the government on the National Anti-Corruption Commission? Where did it get the government with the Voice to Parliament referendum? And the answer is, well, absolutely nowhere. And political parties, when they get into government, they should govern. That's what winning an election means, not caving into the political party that lost the election. And in politics, you just never get your agenda handed to you. You have to fight every inch of the way. You stake your claim, you don't budge, you negotiate with whoever you need to negotiate with, you trade whatever you can, and you get what you want. That's what John Howard's style with Brian Harradine and the Democrats was. Give them nothing until you can't do that anymore. And that's the business of hard negotiation. And overall, this is really a minor issue. Most people couldn't care less about the appointments made to the Reserve Bank Board or any other board for that matter, but the government seems to be losing this process politically. Elected governments have the right to govern, and that's what they should be doing. And they should also relegate the opposition to the position of opposition. And they don't have the right to govern. They lost the election, and I think the Labor government seems to have forgotten about this.
It's almost as if the trauma of being in an opposition to Morrison and Abbott in particular has affected them badly. And now they're not quite sure what to do. And I'd be trying to remove every legacy of the last government just on general principle, including AUKUS, including robo-debt. And by erasing the legacy, that means giving the NAC the proper teeth. And I know that there are 6 serving and former ministers under investigation at the moment, but the NAC has failed in its major tests so far. So it's time Labor toughened up, drank a bucket of concrete, as they say, and hardened up, and went to the Albo who fights Tories. That's what he does. We haven't seen a lot of fighting Tories. Now, of course, Prime Minister shouldn't be a head kicker, but of all the many criticisms you could make of Paul Keating, he never stopped fighting Tories. Of all the many criticisms you could make of Bob Hawke, he never stopped fighting Tories. Gough Whitlam, Kevin Rudd, Julia Gillard. You've got to go out there and fight and keep swinging till you've got no more to swing, and then throw in another couple. You can do that through good policy. You can do it through the pure politics of politics. I'm not the only progressive who isn't understanding what's going on. And I think that things have got to change quickly. Otherwise, the nightmare scenarios, as the left is calling it, minority government is no longer what's going to happen. It's now the best case scenario. And it looks like that Peter Dutton might sneak in. I'm not sure that that's the case. But then again, very few people thought Tony Abbott would be Prime Minister. And here we are, still feeling the results 10 or 12 years down the track.
And speaking of fighting, there's been a series of protests at the Land Forces Exposition in Melbourne, and that's an international military conference where manufacturers from all around the world display their killing machines. And it's an event that's not open to the public. It's an opportunity for military manufacturers to show off their wares to potential buyers in government. And as far as I'm concerned, it's an event that is ripe for protest. And around 2,000 people protested against land forces, and it's been organised by around 50 activist groups under the banner of Disrupt Land Forces, who are protesting against the use of these weapons to kill civilians all around the world, and especially protesting against the war in Gaza by Israel Defence Forces, because a lot of these weapons at this expo have been tested on the civilian populations in Gaza, not just in Gaza, but in Sudan, Ukraine, Yemen, Georgia, Azerbaijan, and quite a few other places around the world. And sociologists have pointed out that conflict is a part of the human condition, but the biggest task for the world is to minimise conflict, and when it does appear, to end those conflicts as quickly as possible. But there's a contradiction here where the arms trade is the biggest industries in the world, and the United States controls around 40% of the global military industry. So we should be trying to minimise conflict, but there's one country that tries to increase conflict because it has a financial and economic interest in this industry. So protesting a military conference in Melbourne, it's bizarre that such an event even exists, especially in Australia, but it should be protested as much as possible.
These things aren't wanted in Australia. They're not needed either. The military knows who it wants, and who are you selling to other than the military? You know, I suppose it's possible that there are other militaries from Singapore and Thailand and Vietnam and Cambodia, etc., coming over to have a look. But again, with an internet, these things are just not feasible, wanted, nor needed in Australia. And the protests have got quite nasty, with acid being flung at police and police using rubber bullets and pepper bullets and things like that, and tear gas. And really, it shouldn't come to that in Australia over this type of issue. Hopefully this will be the last time such an event is held in anywhere in Australia.
And also these sorts of conferences, well, it's not that they just happen here, they happen all around the world, but they really are sanitised events that have a dissonance between that buzz and aura of conference rooms and display halls, and there's a dissonance between that and the effects of their output, and that's the killing of civilians, women and children, and the destruction of infrastructure, and that's the main effect of warfare in the 21st century. And we also get the similarities with the US gun lobby, and with that argument that it's not guns that kill people, it's the people who do the killing. And here's Beck Shrimpton from the pro-war Australian Strategic Policy Institute.
We are talking about activities done by humans, not just machines, which I always remind people there's a human behind these machines, either directing it or making a decision to deploy it, even in the case of autonomy, as we're seeing at the moment. Nobody wants war who are at these places, but there's a recognition that the world is not what we want it to be. You have to take it as it is, and it's an increasingly dangerous place.
And I think that's quite a facile argument, and just a suggestion that perhaps if the military wasn't normalised and promoted in this way, and if the arms trade wasn't so massive, well, the world wouldn't be such a dangerous place. But I think that in this case, Australia is trying to get the best of both worlds, trying to minimise its role politically, but is actually involved in the weapons trade in a much larger way than it would like to admit. There's the Pine Gap issue in Alice Springs, there's AUKUS, there's export permits to Israel. And Israel defence companies were at the Land Forces Conference trying to sell military equipment to Australia that they said that they'd had 4 decades of experience with, and didn't actually outline that it's 4 decades of experience in suppressing and massacring Palestinians. And this idea of Australia becoming a bigger player in the arms trade started off with Christopher Pyne back in 2017 when he was the Minister of Defence, and he said that he wanted Australia to become a top 10 producer of military equipment. And I think Australians would be horrified to know what the plans are for Australia's military manufacturing industry, in which countries it's planning to sell this military hardware to, and the purposes for this equipment. But a lot of this has just been flying under the radar, and I think we need to know a lot more about what's going on here.
It defeats me. It really does. Again, Christopher Pyne waited all of 4 milliseconds before taking a well-paid job in the defence industry after being Defence Minister. Nothing sus. I think we need to have a more mature approach rather than being big boys' toys. We should be looking at what is a rational and mature way of defence. It's sad, we probably do need weapons, and we do need a defence force. And let's be fair too, the Defence Force doesn't only fight, It helps in natural disasters, it helps with catastrophes, etc. But we don't need this showing of big boys' toys to try and show how big and tough and how well we can cope with big and tough. The world has changed, or the world is changing, and I think we need to think about, what do we mean when we say Defence Force? What do we mean when we say border security? What do we mean when we say land security? What does a modern war look like? It doesn't look like Gallipoli. It doesn't look like World War II. It doesn't look like Vietnam. I don't think it looks a lot like Afghanistan 20 years ago. We've got to rethink before things go horribly wrong and we're left behind in a terrible position that we can't get out of.
This is New Politics, available through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Audible and YouTube, and also available to support at Patreon, Substack, and at our website, newpolitics.com.au.
Mining continues to be used as a prop for the next election, and after the Prime Minister's visit to Western Australia last week, Peter Dutton has addressed the Mineral Council of Australia to say that he is the best friend of the mining industry, with a promise to turbocharge a pipeline of 420 mining projects, and channeling Donald Trump when he said that he wants to see more excavators digging, more gas flowing and more trucks moving. And he sounds a little bit like a kid playing in a sandpit there, but it might end up being a battle where the leaders just keep upping the ante, and there might be a mining project on each street corner if we're not careful with all this stuff. But it's reached the point of the ridiculous where there's a wide range of issues being stretched to oblivion, mining being one of them, and the coalition has also gone a bit ballistic over the live sheep export trade. Here's Peter Dutton at a protest with farmers in Canberra.
So what we're talking about here is common sense. Is there support for common sense in this audience? The common sense we want is for West Australian farmers to be given a future. We are here as Liberals and Nationals today to send a very clear message to you that we support your today and we support your tomorrow and your future. From the very first moment this announcement was made, committed that we would reverse this bad decision.
And it was like a who's who of the coalition. David Littleproud was there, Michaelia Cash was there, Linda Reynolds, fresh from her defamation case against a rape victim, was also there. And so was the Deputy Leader of the Liberal Party, Susan Ley, even though this is what she said back in 2018 against the live sheep export trade.
I know all the arguments that are used to support the live sheep trade because I ran them myself for 15 years. Recently I found cause to look at the industry with fresh eyes. I've been shocked, angered, bewildered and disappointed. I have researched the science, the facts, the economics and the opinions. I have not allowed emotions to overcome reason. The case for continuing long-haul live sheep exports fails on both economic and animal welfare grounds.
And most of this is a points of difference style of politics, where on mining, the Liberal Party wants to be seen more like the mining industry than even the mining industry is, and paint the Labor government as anti-mining, and it's now pro-live sheep export, even though when they were in government, they wanted to end the live sheep export trade, or at least the Liberal Party did. And this is the Liberal Party at its worst, where it finds a tiny issue that hardly affects anyone and magnifies it to a level where more people feel that they are being threatened, or they pull the emotional strings to make it seem like people's livelihoods are at risk, even though they're not. But that's all they have. They have no policies, they have no ideas. All they have is to say no to everything, make noise and cause trouble. And with these issues, it's not just the environment and animal welfare that misses out, but the Australian public as well. We just keep getting more and more junk coming in from this opposition, and it just has to end.
Why members of the Liberal Party would want to go against the constitutional right of the Australian Commonwealth to own the natural resources of the country defeats me, except they hate government. They hate things that stop their rich donors getting wealthier. even though they're incredibly wealthy enough. Again, this is why Labor, I know that Labor is trying to protect the workers, at least ostensibly, the workers in the mining industry. But I don't know that getting them less pay and making the owners wealthier is the best way of organising the mining industry in Australia.
Well, a lot of this is the politics of grievance and the fear of missing out as well. And in politics, I think that's a terrible combination because the electorate is just in this perpetual state of just being thoroughly pissed off about everything. And, this is from a political party that just offers no solutions. And that's exactly the same strategy of Pauline Hanson and One Nation. Absolute anger about everything and never offer any solutions. But that's One Nation. They're a group of extremists. They get their 5% of the vote and that's it. They'll never get into government. But the coalition is in a position where they can form government. Still, they never offer any solutions. But it's had success with this in the past. The anti-mining tax campaign in 2010, the anti-franking credits campaign in 2019, somehow that morphed into death taxes. And they also tried with the anti-transgender campaign during the 2022 election. That didn't work, but it did create a lot of fear and loathing against the marginalised community. And it's just this process of magnifying specific issues which are pretty much about nothing and affect very few people. And the other point is that on most of these issues that they do try to magnify, if we were unfortunate enough to have them winning the next government, it's not going to make any difference. Mining will always continue to be the major industry in Western Australia and Queensland. And as much as I detest the prospect of more mining, it's unlikely to drop with a change in government. Labor keeps approving more coal mines and gas fields. So on that level, I think there's little difference between a Labor and a Liberal government with respect to mining. And with live sheep exports, politics is littered with examples of politicians and political parties who change their views, usually when the facts change. But most of this change of view is because the politics have changed. One of the placards at the Liberal Party rally in Canberra was of a dog saying that it will also lose its job if the live sheep export changes do go ahead. And just this level of idiocy, we have to check with the Bureau of Statistics to see exactly how many dogs will lose their jobs, what sort of salaries they are on, and how this will affect gross domestic product and inflation levels. But it's absolutely ridiculous and stupid, but it still gets traction. And I think that's what the problem is.
I don't understand why they want live sheep exporting. It's hideously cruel.
Well, they didn't want it when they were in government in 2018.
Yeah, I've never understood the faction who do want it. I know that Muslim countries and Jewish countries need their meat butchered in a specific way, but Australia does that. I know of at least one major abattoir in rural New South Wales who exports, and they get the imams in on Friday and the rabbis in on Saturday to check that the process was done properly, and they make sure that the appropriate rituals have been performed, and then it gets sent over. So that stops that. There might be the odd market which wants to do it themselves, but I don't think that's a majority position by any standard. And a good abattoir employs hundreds of people, and with those jobs, there's a knock-on. So it defeats me why you'd want to starve a sheep to death. And if the sheep isn't killed properly, it's worthless. You can't eat a sheep that has starved to death or has died of heat stroke, or a cow, or has had a stroke. It's just insane. It really is.
And I think generally this is the method. The coalition makes noise, the media listens in and amplifies the message, and the coalition, they should be really down and out at this stage of the political cycle. They've really got nothing to offer. But I think that this whole bipartisan thing by Albanese has really lifted the coalition off the canvas, or helped lift them off the canvas. And by not going hard enough on Peter Dutton, trying to be reasonable with a very unreasonable politician. The Aston by-election in April 2023, when the Labor Party won the seat of Aston with a massive swing towards it, when the coalition was widely expected to win that seat, that's when the Labor government should have been really, really hard on Dutton and never let him get up again. And Anthony Albanese did say that he would never underestimate Peter Dutton, but I think they have overestimated Peter Dutton and given him the respect that he does not deserve and has never done anything to earn that respect. And this is the end result. The Labor government is in a tough contest with an absolute political lightweight and a destructive character, when the next election should be a lot easier than it is for the government at the moment.
Dutton should be struggling in the polls. It should be the rumours flying around about Dutton being replaced rather than Anthony Albanese being replaced. I don't necessarily believe the rumours, but the rumours are there. You've got the easiest person in the world. I mean, Paul Keating was able to take down a man of much more substance in John Hewson. Keating would have made mincemeal of Dutton. We'd have wondered who he was and how he'd ever got to the position. And yet, here they are, pretending that he is someone of substance. And sure, it's good not to underestimate him, but what is it you underestimate? It's certainly not his abilities and wisdom and insight. You underestimate his cunningness and slyness and dirty tricks. That's where you go wrong with Dutton. But because the Labor cabinet is much, much, much smarter on the whole than the Liberal shadow cabinet, it shouldn't be a problem. Yet for some reason it is. Again, there might be a bigger game being played that we can't see. But till I see it, I'm going to keep holding them to account.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you'd like to support our style of journalism and commentary, please make a donation at our website at newpolitics.com.au. We don't beg, plead, beseech or gaslight you about journalism coming to an end. We just keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.
I have to celebrate you, baby. I have to praise you like I should.